Hello and welcome to Book Corner, where I read, review, and recommend books. Today I'll review the book Gaza, an inquest into its martyrdom, written by Norman Finklestein, published first in 2018. Norman Finklestein is probably the foremost knowledgeable author on Gaza, its people, their circumstances, and their history. He has a PhD in political science from Princeton University and has researched, written, and spoken extensively on the Holocaust and on the ongoing conflicts between Palestine and Israel. He was born in 1953 in New York to parents who were both Holocaust survivors, in which his mother was in the Majdanek concentration camp and his father was in Auschwitz. Well, you may ask, why should anyone even want to read Gaza? Well, with current situation unfolding day by day, reading this book would help shed some light on what's going on and definitely help a person to realize that it's not all happening in a vacuum and didn't all start on October 7th. This book would be beneficial to those who don't know much about Gaza. The previous history of Gaza is similar to what is going on now, except that what is going on now is exponentially more intense. This book will help you to understand the history and detailed accounts of that small area. Finkelstein's book is extremely comprehensive, in which it is meticulously detailed with footnotes, tables and graphs, and an extensive index. He does a thorough job in documenting and providing detailed references to everything that he writes. In the beginning of the book, Finkelstein describes what Gaza actually is. It is impossible to understand why the violence has and is taking place unless the reader becomes aware of the situation, limitations, and the borders of the Gaza Strip itself and who controls these borders. The author describes the Gaza Strip as 5 miles wide by 25 miles long. There are approximately 2.3 million people living within its confines. 70% of them are refugees or descendants of refugees from 1948, when Israel kicked them out from their ancestral homes and sent them to live in Gaza. Half of Gaza's population are children. It is one of the most densely populated places on earth. In 2006, when Hamas won the elections, Israel set up and imposed a brutal blockade by erecting tall concrete walls, high-tech surveillance, and entry and exit gates. No one could go in or out unless they had permission from Israel. It became like a large open-air prison with its inhabitants trapped inside. In fact, David Cameron, the Prime Minister of the UK, called Gaza an open-air prison in July 2010. Baruch Kimmerling, an Israeli sociologist from the Hebrew University, called Gaza the world's largest concentration camp ever, back in 2003. Israel controls every aspect of life there, from water to electricity to fuel to food. About 500 aid trucks used to pass through the gates every day to deliver food, medicine, fuel, and necessities. Israel has even counted the number of calories each person was allowed to have, which was enough to keep the people just above starvation level, and determined what foods can be or cannot be on those trucks. This is the backdrop of information we have to understand if we want to comprehend what is going on and why. Finkelstein divides the book into 4 major parts. First, Operation Cast Lead, the Goldstone Report, the Mavi Marmara, and Operation Protective Edge. The first part of the book recalls Operation Cast Lead, which took place from December 26, 2008 to January 17, 2009. The Amnesty International report called it the 22 Days of Death and Destruction. Finkelstein starts with outlining years prior to the situation and what led up to this bloodshed. Basically, when Israel was defeated in southern Lebanon and had to withdraw their forces, Israel decided that they needed to reestablish their deterrence capacity. Deterrence capacity is basically a fear factor. If the Arabs fear Israel, then it will deter them from challenging Israel. Since the Israelis were defeated in Lebanon, it may give the Palestinians the idea that Israel is not to be feared anymore, so they need to do something, which is something violent, in order to reestablish deterrence. After losing in Lebanon, Israel then took revenge on Gaza. Operation Cast Lead began when Israel breached a ceasefire agreement and the Israeli Air Force forged an aerial blitz flying over Gaza, dropping 1,000 tons of explosives, while the Israeli army used robotic and TV-aided remote control guns by land. After the operation came to a halt, Finkelstein documents the extent of the carnage from such organizations as Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, Beit Salim, Red Crescent Society, Physicians for Human Rights Israel, and the UN Development Program, to name a few. He records how much was lost in human life, monetarily, civilian buildings, cultural centers, mosques, educational institutions, infrastructure, property, agriculture, livestock, homes, factories, farms, and greenhouses. About 1,400 Palestinians were killed, mostly civilians, compared to 10 Israelis killed. Finkelstein also records the revealing statements made by IDF soldiers regarding the operation and the evidence reported by Amnesty International. The second part of the book focuses on the Goldstone report and how it became discredited. Richard Goldstone, who had immaculate credentials as a judge and prosecutor, was Jewish and a Zionist who fully supported Israel's right to exist and was named head of the fact-finding mission to investigate all violations of international law and humanitarian law during Operation Cast Lead. His report, which started in April 2009, found that much of the carnage Israel inflicted on the people of Gaza was premeditated. The purpose of Cast Lead was to punish, humiliate, and terrorize the population of Gaza. Despite finding all these humanitarian violations, his report came against severe and ferocious scrutiny by officials in Israel and Washington, in which he presented a point-by-point rebuttal. They tried to discredit him by calling him an anti-Semite, self-hating Jew, and a Holocaust denier. Finkelstein writes about the development of the report, the visceral reaction to the report, and how Goldstone was threatened and pressured into backpedaling and recanting his report despite the devastating accumulation of evidence. The recanting of the Goldstone report gave the Israelis the green light to commit further devastating atrocities in the future with impunity and lack of accountability. The third part of the book is about the Mavi Marmara, which is a flotilla that was loaded with 10,000 tons of aid headed to Gaza on May 31st, 2010. Gaza was still facing devastation after the aftermath of Cast Lead, not being able to recover or rebuild due to Israel's blockade, and they desperately needed help. This ship was in international waters and had 700 passengers on board when it got attacked by Israeli commandos who shot to death 9 of its passengers. Finkelstein outlines the actions of the Israeli commandos and the people who were on board the flotilla and the responses and reports of various human rights organizations. While Israel tried to spin and justify the assault and play the victim, the passengers recount the events and what happened in detail. These passengers' death was likened to summary execution, where they were unnecessarily shot several times. Israel decided then to launch its own investigation called the Turkle Report, which basically exonerated them from culpability and rather put the blame on the passengers. Finkelstein points out the contradictions of this report on many aspects, including its presuppositions, the timeline of events, and who ran cover for this whitewash operation. 14 years as of today, there is right now another flotilla waiting in Turkey, ready to take off to help the people of Gaza with necessary food and aid. We should take note and make observation to see that if, after 14 years after the attack on the Mavi Marmara, if anything will be different with this current flotilla, or will it repeat an all too familiar pattern? The fourth part of the book is about Operation Protective Edge, which started on July 8, 2014, and went on for 51 days. 2,200 people in Gaza were killed, mostly civilians, and 18,000 homes severely damaged. It started when a new consensus government was formed in April 2014 between Fatah in the West Bank and Hamas in Gaza. The USA and EU cautiously welcomed it, which at this point, Benjamin Netanyahu became so enraged that he sought to sabotage it. When 3 Israeli teenage boys in the West Bank were kidnapped and killed by a rogue Hamas cell, it gave Netanyahu the excuse and a green light, despite knowing they were already dead, to start his raid on the West Bank. He pretended it was a rescue mission in order to elicit a response from Hamas, despite knowing that Hamas's leadership was not responsible for the deaths of the teenagers. The same day the Malaysian airliner over Ukraine was downed, creating a distraction for the world from Middle East politics, Netanyahu launched a disproportionate and relentless air and ground offensive against Gaza on July 17th, 2014. Finally, on August 3rd, Ban Ki-moon, UN Secretary General, came out against Israel for bombing 7 UN shelters and schools housing civilians. Obama also condemned Israel's actions as well. The atrocities finally ended on August 26th. On page 219, Finkelstein records IDF testimonies about the operation. On page 311, there is a chart of some critical comparisons. From pages 278 to 283 are Amnesty International's case studies with a timeline and Finkelstein's comments. After reading this book, I was completely heartbroken. The horrors that have been inflicted upon Gaza have been going on for decades. The stories of 2009 and 2014 sound almost exactly like the stories of today, with the only difference being is that the atrocities now are multiplied exponentially. My assessment is that Gaza is a continuation of a hideous nightmare that has become ever increasingly darker and abhorrently appalling all the way up until this present moment. Finkelstein says, and I quote, "Gaza is about a big lie composed of 1,000 often seemingly abstruse and arcane little lies." He says, "The big lie is that Gaza is an aggressor. Gaza is aggressing against Israel, and Israel is acting in self-defense. Gaza is about how Israel rationalizes death and destruction campaigns on an already battered population and how its own public and Western audiences buy into that propaganda." In Norman Finkelstein's conclusion, I find the most applicably stark reality in which senior Israeli officials concluded that another war with Gaza was inevitable. To quote what they said on page 360, "We cannot conduct a constant war of attrition. Therefore, the next conflict has to be the last conflict." Let that sink in for a while. After reading Norm Finkelstein's book on Gaza, I would definitely recommend it. It is very informative and heartbreakingly honest and well documented. If you are looking to learn more about Gaza, then this is the book that you should definitely read. It will shed light on what has gone on in the past in order to help understand what is going on today and why. In the comments, please let me know if you have read this book or plan to read this book. If you'd like to leave a comment about the book, please, I ask that you have read the book in order to make a well-informed and intelligent comment about it. Otherwise, I'll see you next time in the next book review. Bye for now.